Okay, now I feel I'm like, I'm in chill. Yeah. Like, I'm here. It's a little.
You're going to steal yours.
Okay.
And I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you.
Hello. Hello. Oh, no, that's not on yet.
Hello. Oh, that is extremely loud. There we go. Hi. Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Mary. I run Lighthouse, and I absolutely love Frontierlands. And I'm so excited that you've all come out on this really spring day. It's like almost kind of spring. To enjoy an evening of looking at the world slightly differently and how we reclaim these spaces. And it's such a tonic for this moment we're in. Afterwards, we're going to have a little drinks reception next door, so if you want to keep the ideas fizzing around, you're not ready to go out into the cold, then stick around, have a wee glass of wine, or whiskey or whatever, next door. Get a book signed, you can ask your questions. Anyone who's watching online, you can ask in the chat as well. Let us know if there's any issues with sound. But I'm just going to hand over to the wonderful Rosie, who is going to be our host for tonight. Will you all join me in welcoming Rosie and Hazel?
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. As Mary said, I'm Rosie. I'll pass over to Hazel in a second to give a short introduction, but just to say a brief few words about me, not because I've written the book, but just because it might give you a sense of where I'm coming from with some of the questions tonight. And yeah, I'm also really looking forward to like drawing on what I'm sure is a lot of expertise in the room from lots of kind of community projects, community organising, and yeah, we'll probably chat for about 35, 40 minutes and then open it up to questions from the audience. But yeah, I am a campaigner and researcher. I've been a kind of work in a day job for an environmental NGO and have been involved in kind of living rent and other kind of tenant and trade union organising. But I suppose like my research interest in this is down to my kind of PhD, which I wrote on left-wing spaces in the 80s in Scotland. I finished that a year or so ago. So yeah, it was been really nice to chat to Hazel in the kind of prep for this about kind of spaces, past and present, and what it means to have projects and things like this going on, and what we take for granted and what we don't. So if you spot a theme across any of the questions that I ask, you know why. And I'll hand over quickly to Hazel to say words about her own introduction.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here. So thank you very much for agreeing to it.
I'm very happy.
And thank you. My name is Hazel Sheffield. I'm a journalist and I live in Hastings, which is about 7 hours away on the train.
Yes, fantastic. So yeah, thank you so much for such a brilliant book. It was just so rich and full of like case studies to kind of learn from and draw from, and I think lots of really resonant stuff that's kind of applicable across like lots of different kind of community projects and different kind of geographical locations as well. Ask the kind of classic question of how did you come to write this book? What was the kind of journey that took you to there?
Yeah, thank you, Rosie. Well, there were two ways to answer the question. I guess the book itself started life 10 years ago when I was the business editor of The Independent in London. One of my colleagues from The Independent is here in the room. We now have a book club where we commiserate each other over that experience. But I was there at the moment that the Brexit referendum was announced, and as a business editor, we were watching the markets basically, and nobody thought it was going to happen. And then on the day that it happened, I just had this like real sense that whatever we were doing in London, looking at markets and polls and everything else was completely meaningless. And actually, because it had been a huge shock, of course, that we voted to leave, that I just needed to get out and start meeting people who weren't in London and finding out what was going on around the country. So I was very lucky to get a grant, and I started going out in search of what I called alternative economies. I didn't really know what that meant at the time, but I met lots of amazing community organisations, and 10 years later, I was able to kind of pull that together in Frontierlands. But I think the other way to answer that question, really honestly, is that when I first got my publishing contract for this book, I just had a baby, a little boy called Stanley. And when I finished the book, the fact-checking for the book in September, I'd not long had a second son, with baby Larry. And I was just completely consumed with anxieties about how to live in the world. I just found, I just didn't know how to mother and to work at the same time, like how to work without doing harm. Just what I could do that would feel productive and useful. And I think, although I'd always wanted to write a book, I didn't realise that writing this book would kind of teach me how to be in the world. And through meeting these people who made it their kind of life's work to tackle that question head on every day, I really did kind of find a compass of how to be in the world, and I'm just very grateful every day that I got the opportunity to go out and meet them. So.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I think that's like really moving to kind of hear the work and the labour behind it, which is like poignantly quite a strong theme throughout the book of kind of uncovering the different networks of labour and stuff that sustain all these different projects. And we'll probably touch on that a little bit later, but I think it's so nice to see the kind of backdrop to somebody writing such like a labour of love and kind of what was going on at the same time. So it's always really nice to have the two sides of that, the answer to that question. But before, I'm sure we'll dig into that, but I guess you have such a wide range of different case studies throughout the book, and the kind of different chapters covering them is so, like, the narrative that draws them all together is really rich. But the kind of theme is this, kind of reclamation, as you say, and I think kind of talk about it as, a kind of fighting against that kind of enclosure of the commons, and that kind of crops up. I wondered if you could kind of take us through that a little bit more and speak a bit more to that kind of, that arc of resistance or reclamation that kind of charts through a lot of the case studies that you chose to focus on.
So the book is about this idea of Frontierlands, which is derelict land and buildings all over the UK, and the communities who are reimagining them. So I guess it's about our fascination with these empty places, these kind of abandoned places, and I've become kind of obsessed with them, and I think that these places, I'm thinking about derelict factories and closed down mines or forests that we can't enter, workshops, workplaces, even your high street, the empty buildings on your high street. I think that there is a kind of nostalgia to these places. The word nostalgia means a longing to return home. It makes me think about the word Heimweh in German too, which is literally kind of homesickness, but it's actually about a kind of longing for comfort or security. And I think that at first glance it seems to be about nostalgia for place, but actually what I think it's about is nostalgia for a different time. I think we live in a moment where time feels like it's accelerating and maybe even ending. Feels like the end of the world is very close. And I think nostalgia in these moments is a very powerful idea. The right to use it as a very powerful idea. But I think I'm concerned not with time as a linear thing, progress or growth or whatever you might call that, but the cyclical nature of time. And I think that each of these buildings in its own way is a world that has already ended. The world of coal mining in the South Wales valleys, or metalworking in the Midlands, or clay mining in Cornwall, all places in the book. And it reminds us that, I describe them, the abandoned places, as a kind of language or a dialect that's etched onto our landscape that we kind of used to know how to speak. And I'm interested in that idea that we kind of still know how to speak those languages, how to make things and live in a more kind of relational way, even if it's an extractive way with the land beneath us, and that we can still kind of get back to that. I think that's why, So I think that the derelict spaces, they offer us a kind of, not only a way to look at the past, but maybe clues to ways to think about the future as well.
Yeah, I really love that. And I think especially the kind of threads you're drawing out there around nostalgia and, and as you mentioned, that can be very well weaponized. But actually, as a kind of as mentioned, like being a historian, it's like, how do you draw from the past in a way that is like future orientated and isn't about this hark back to, you know, a traditional way of doing things, which often has very like dangerous connotations, but instead is about that cyclical thing that you say, and is like, well, we're part of this rotation of history which draws on the past but looks towards the future in such a kind of productive way, which you can really clearly feel. And we had a bit of a chat, I think, yesterday about like, you know, how nice that is, and to be able to be as opposed to having to kind of be on the defensive all the time if you're in a project where you're constantly fighting off something or fighting off that kind of enclosure, like to be able to have that future orientation, as you say. To ask you a little bit more about the kind of selection process, that sounds really clinical, but like there's like, you know, really like there's so much in the book, and you spent like a long time kind of searching and looking for different case studies. How did you kind of come to select them in the end? I know you mentioned that there was a few that didn't make it into the book in the end, and different things. Like, how was that process of choosing what would end up in print?
I mean, I started with hundreds. I mean, this is a project that started 10 years ago. I got that grant in 2016. So I've written like hundreds of, I guess, profiles or case studies of these different projects since then. And just, I guess the ones I kept coming back to, ones that felt that they were kind of rooted or challenging in the system in a way that has only become more important, I think, over those 10 years. So the book starts on the edge of the UK in harbours and places that have been very often thought of as kind of left behind. Coastal towns, the five top Brexit voting areas of the UK were all coastal towns. So, you know, the areas of deprivation. I live in one of them in Hastings. And then I sort of plot the journey, almost, it's an overused word, inwards to the city. So we go through a forest that has been completely locked off to the people of the South Wales valleys for many years that they are trying to access. We go on top of an abandoned clay mine, which again has been, the villages around it are called the Clays in Cornwall, but the people who live there can't go up there anymore. It's owned by a French mining conglomerate called Imerys. And then we end up in an old tube works, a factory in the Midlands. And we sort of work our way inwards until we're in the inner city in central London, and people who are being displaced by private equity from railway arches. Now they're abandoned because of them being squeezed out. But and eventually we end up kind of in our own bodies and in our minds, like what are we losing by these processes? So I think in the end, the projects that endured are the ones that I just kept coming back to again and again. And over time, it became clear to me that what these projects were doing was not just about tackling one element of deprivation, but after COVID happened, they were really about survival in certain neighbourhoods. Whatever projects these groups were doing in their neighbourhoods when COVID happened just got completely put aside to feed people and, you know, make sure people who needed medication could get to them. And suddenly, disaster response happened. And that was a real moment when all the groups, well, many of the groups that I document anyway, they started talking to one another all over the country. So I always imagine this kind of map of the UK sort of lighting up as these groups, I mean, they describe themselves as a mycelial network. So all the mutual aid groups, they start talking to one another. How are you doing it? We're using our local pub, you know, we're using the kitchen. The bakery's doing this. Oh, we figured out this way to take payments on the doorstep for shopping deliveries. And as you know, after the pandemic, we all thought that was going to be like the beginning of the revolution, and actually everything just went back to like worse than before almost, and definitely has got worse. But those groups are still there. You know, they have turned their attention once more to like whatever they were doing before. They don't describe themselves outwardly as post-capitalist, but in work that has been done by one of the groups, an amazing group of women called the Onion Collective in Watchet in West Somerset, they all describe themselves as working towards alternative futures. And there were 2,000 of these groups, and they were comfortable with the word post-capitalist. They just weren't putting it on their grant applications. So I think that's what eventually captured my imagination. And then, of course, we're thinking about climate crisis. I mean, climate crisis is hit, right? We're living in climate emergency right now. We've just had some of the worst flooding ever for the last few months. I don't think there's any doubt that like this is happening. And the groups that are stepping up and helping people in those emergencies, they're the ones in the neighbourhood, you know? And if another pandemic happens, it will be the groups in the neighbourhood. And that is when local authorities, they begin to defer to these groups, because the groups know what the people need, you know, that the money starts to go into the right places. So although none of us would wish for catastrophe, I have hope. It's a dangerous word, because I have seen how those groups have come to the fore in emergencies, and that they will do again.
Yeah, I think you touched on so much there, and there's a couple of different things I want to come back to in different questions, but I suppose you mentioned kind of at the beginning about this question of kind of left behind, or in kind of Jess Steele in one of the kind of intros is saying kind of these places are left alone rather than kind of left behind. And I can hear, like, in what you mentioned there about the role of these kind of groups and spaces during crises and like what we're looking towards. And I wonder, is there ever like that kind of tension of like, well, it shouldn't have to be us that necessarily fill the gaps, but it is so crucial, and how do you kind of balance that of like, we do know best, but also you should know best as the people. And, you know, to speak to a Scottish context for people I think you look at how community is used sometimes in Scotland. I work in climate during the day, and you talk about community ownership, and which is crucial of like different, you know, you want community owned energy or you want community owned wind farms, but then you kind of hear politicians kind of talk about it as if it's like, and that'll raise money for public services. It's like, well, like, no, like if communities own it, they should get the revenue to go on like whatever they want, really. It should be like, you know, increased ownership at like the local authority level that pays for essential services. It shouldn't be communities footing the bill for things that really, so there's sometimes that toss up where we, like people that I chat to, we go back and forth of like, what is the role here? And and I don't think the groups are doing it themselves, of course not, but there's something about how do we do this important work that's so led by people at the kind of grassroots, whilst also not letting the people in charge off the hook for being like, yeah, they've got it. That community over there is sorting out their own mutual aid networks. We don't need to do anything with them. That kind of like laissez-faireism that sometimes creeps in.
I would suggest that many of the places in this book, they don't have that toss-up anymore. They've been left behind for so long that there isn't really an alternative. And actually, I think there is a rich history of this in Scotland too. I think I live Egg, I live Mulg. There are places, very places in Scotland where no one was coming to figure that out, you know. And actually, most of the places in this book, the first chapter is about this place, Watch It, in West Somerset. It's known as the most isolated town in the whole of the UK. Everything has disappeared. Their paper factory has moved inland. Their harbour has disappeared. Multiple layers of local authorities have just shrunk and gone, you know, to Bristol or Taunton. And so this is Jess Prendergast, who lives in Watch It. She's part of the Sunken collective, these women who have built, they've built a £7 million art gallery on the quayside that was shuttered for many years in this entirely isolated place. And it is the most extraordinary art gallery. It looks like as good as the Turner or the Tate, but it's a place where people are really using art to reimagine the world. And they have these symposiums and bring together all these artists working in the cracks. And it's the most inspiring and joyful place to be. But it's Jess who says they were left alone. They weren't left behind. And I think, actually, to many people, that can sound a bit naive. Like you said, like, oh, well, you're just making the best of a bad situation. But actually, we're now learning that the places that are most resilient to climate catastrophe are actually not developed nations. There's a book that's just about to come out about this by an economist called John Rapley, and he's studied the way that less developed nations, to use the parlance, are actually much more resilient to climate change because they already have these support networks, the mutual aid. They know how to survive in disaster because they, Jess calls it, we've lived in a state of disaster for a long time. No one has come to help them. And I think I've seen through the book, it's actually it's not naive to think that. And it was true again during the pandemic. The places that had, you know, in Watch It, for example, they have 120 volunteer groups. This is a place that scores routinely like the worst for social mobility in the whole of the UK, lowest wages for small and medium enterprises. You know, by all of the central government metrics, it's failing, and yet it has people out in these volunteer groups every night of the week. The people who live there, that is the economy to them. You know, it's not something that's defined by people in offices in London. It is the way that people interact in the street and the help that they give one another. It's just that we are not familiar with the models that value that kind of economy, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Talking again about kind of experience and expertise and what is so like present throughout the book, I was rereading it this morning, just kind of refreshing my notes, and there's a quote that's like from not one of the projects that's really, I'll read it in a second, but just to think about like how embedded like community consultation is within so many of these projects. Like you read the chapters and it's like, and we did this and we asked these many people what they wanted, and there's such like a take, like just it's a given that you would go and speak to your friends, your neighbours about what would actually be good for the area instead. And just to contrast that to a quote in the kind of hoardings chapter, when you ask the kind of founder of the Eden project one of the founder of Eden about the kind of proposals that they were putting forward in Morecambe, what would happen if you asked the people of Morecambe what to build, and his reply was, that would be the way to build the biggest piece of rubbish you can imagine. And I've like written despicable in red letters, like, so it was raging, because it's just, and you see that all the time, like just that kind of disdain for these poor people who don't know what's best for them at all. And it would be obvious, like it's so obviously unthinkable that you would ask people who live in a community or not even ask, like leave it up to them in the way that you've just kind of set out. Is there, I wondered, you kind of covered bits of it already in this last answer, but just like, how do we kind of embed more of that, like being led by the people who live in the area, who know the best and stuff? Because again, to show my kind of Scottish government hat in some of the work, it's like they talk about it all the time, like we are co-designing. It's like, what does that mean? Like, who are you actually talking to? Because it doesn't seem to be playing out in anything you actually build. So what is that? Yeah, what examples can we maybe draw from the work of the people in this book of like how to actually do that kind of meaningful participation?
Well, I think about where I live in Hastings, there is an organisation called the Hastings Commons. So just around the corner from where I live, there was this derelict factory, a print works. It was the home to the Hastings Observer, a local newspaper. It was built in 1924, and it had just been boarded up ever since privatisation. It lasted about 60 years, and then in 84, with privatisation and Thatcher, it shut down. It's this huge 7-storey thing, and it's like right there when you come out of the train station. So it was a total eyesore, and it just had these like bits of sheet like peeling off it. People called it the rotting heart of the neighbourhood. And for many years, this organisation, before it was called the Hastings Commons, had been trying to build affordable housing in a valley in Hastings, in one of the poorest estates in Hastings, on toxic ground, basically, where a former power station had been, and they wanted to build affordable housing for the community. And for various reasons, this campaign lasted many years, didn't work. But even as that was falling apart, they were putting the building blocks in place to start taking over buildings in the centre of Hastings. They didn't start with the printworks. They started with an office building next door called Rock House. And then they were able to leverage the money from this office building to eventually, after this building had cycled through 13 private owners, every single one of them just mothballed it and waited to sell it on till it had raised, and the asset price had raised. Eventually the community finally bought it in 2018. And now the Hastings Commons, I'm a commoner, so the idea is that it's harking back to the Commons, and Ostrom has done a lot of work around this, and of course common land, the land that we all used to have access to before the enclosures, which we can talk about. So yeah, the idea is that you are a commoner, you are practicing commoning, and that these constellation of buildings are the Hastings Commons. And the building has been very slowly renovated according to like a patchwork of grants over the years. I think Jess says it's over 100 different bits of funding she's had to pull together. And all of those grants have their own, accountability, reporting, different demands. So it's totally exhausting. And now the building is open, but it's still not, it's not open in the way that a developer would open it, making sure everything's shiny and finished. But she has this idea of phased organic development. So the idea is that you get it safe. Some of the floors weren't safe even when they opened for the first time. And then you open the doors and then you wait to see what ideas present themselves. So you're not prescribing usage. You're saying, this is the space, what's going to happen here? And slowly uses are emerging. I wrote some of the book in this beautiful co-working space on one of the floors. There was this incredible mezzanine floor where they had a kind of digital fabrication lab for young people. They opened a youth club temporarily on the site. They literally had to go around in Hastings giving hot chocolate vouchers to kids so that they would come in, because kids were so used to having absolutely nowhere to go. Hastings has one of the highest rates of young people who don't have, who are not in education or training or work. The situation for youth everywhere is dire, but it's particularly bad there. So just even getting them in through the doors so that they can have a warm place to go on a dark evening out, in the winter is extraordinary, I think. And not only that, but slowly other buildings in the neighbourhood are being renovated by the same process. So last Monday I was at my quiet practice in the latest one, which is now the permanent home for young people. It's been co-designed with young people, and it is literally an old sofa warehouse that young people have made. They've stripped out all of the like cladding on the top, and so it's this beautiful kind of industrial interior, and it's full of old sofas. So the kids can still come, and now they can make their own hot chocolates. There's a beautiful kitchen there for them to do that. But yeah, in answer to your question, there is no systemic way for this work to happen. It is truly exhausting for the people who lead it. But it is deeply, deeply community-led. The idea that this phased organic development idea is, there's a whole chapter about some women in Plymouth who are doing a very similar thing on a street called Union Street. The whole idea is that you open the door and you see what happens, which is so different to the way that master plans and developers work. In fact, the women in Plymouth have a manifesto and they call it the Mistress Plan. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Wow, just sounds incredible. And I guess you mentioned it a couple of times there about the kind of exhaustion of funding and kind of grant raising and fundraising and different things. And I don't know about others in the room, but that feels quite pertinent to me and things. And because I think looking back, maybe to compare to some of the spaces that I looked at around in the 1980s, there was there was grants and there was different things, but there was it just felt a little bit easier. That's the kind of sense I got from talking to people. And now I suppose maybe a bit of the development of the third sector and the kind of NGOification of some things. How do you quantify the work that you're doing in these spaces into objectives in a grant application and to do that? And I really like the phrase that you said where, these people are happy with the term post-capitalist, just can't go on the grant. They don't use it in the grant sometimes, which I think lots of us can relate to, and it kind of becomes that cycle. I guess, would you be able to say a bit more about how are they navigating that kind of thing and doing this kind of quite transformative work?
I think it's totally a moving and developing field all the time, but there are some foundations out there who are moving quite radically into this moment. I think one of them is called Lankelly Chase. And they announced a spend down strategy. So rather than just spending what they earn on their interest from their money every year, they're now essentially spending down all of the funding that they have. They've decided that we're in climate emergency. It's no good having money in the bank. Let's get it out there. And I would also point to something called the Good Ancestor Movement and the Tudor Trust. So one of the groups that I've documented is in Birmingham. They are the group that's taking over this old tube works in this former metalworking area of industrial Birmingham. They're turning it into a neighbourhood public square. Essentially, it will be a place to get recycled materials to retrofit your house. It will be a place where you can use tool libraries, where you can learn how to retrofit your house or your building wherever you are, where you can shelter in a heat wave. This is central Birmingham. There's a reservoir, but not much else in terms of shade. You can go there if you're cold. You can get food in the canteen. Again, like many generative uses. And they have for many years been working towards the ownership of the land. And that's really key to most of the groups in this book. They need to own the land. It's too easy to be displaced. And I think actually that you asked earlier how I decided which projects went in. And it was sort of self-selecting in a way because many didn't go the distance. Many of the projects didn't last 10 years. And the ones that did, they were working towards ownership. So in the Hastings Commons model, that's through Community Land Trust. In Birmingham, this factory that they are turning into the neighbourhood public square, they bought with funding from these two these two foundations called the Tudor Trust and the Good Ancestor Movement. And yeah, the people on the boards who give this money, they don't have any rose-tinted glasses about what is needed to for us to survive. But it definitely takes for many more funders to learn from them, I think, before many of these groups are going to have anything like stable funding. Even in the Hastings Commons, everything relies on getting the next National Lottery grant or what they're applying for next. It's it's precarious.
Yeah. Just because you mentioned it there, and we could have touched on it earlier about, the question of the goal is ownership and kind of thinking about that. Do you want to say a little more on the kind of enclosure in the commons and that kind of idea and that how that seems to the foundationalness of that in kind of the projects and particularly the ones that kind of commons approach?
Yeah, thank you. I was just trying to figure out actually before I came here, did Scotland have the same process of enclosures as the UK, as England? I don't know. I'll tell you what the process was in England. You can tell me maybe, but in England, in England and Wales anyway, half of the land in 1500 was what we called common land. So anybody could graze their cattle and collect firewood and subsist in that way. You didn't have to own the land. And then gradually, through a process that we now call enclosure, these rights were eroded. And this was kind of enshrined in parliamentary acts in the 18th and 19th century. So we start to see people are no longer have access to common land, fences, control. Yes, so the people who are most affected by this is the amazing historian called Silvia Federici has done some work around this. The people who are most affected by this were people who had no other means to make a living. So old women, for example, had to start begging from door to door for firewood and food, and the emergence of witches is in tandem with this process. So we start to see how women, if they were denied, they were then called a witch. They put a hex on your family, if you didn't give them what they were asking for at the door. So, the active enclosure, it wasn't just about losing land, it's also about a kind of enclosure of the mind, and who gets targeted in that process. Now, Jess Steele, she's commoner at large in the Hastings Commons, where I live in Hastings. She has this idea that outpricing on the open market today is a modern form of enclosure. And I think what she means by that is that when they're trying to get access to these buildings, whatever it is, Sofa Warehouse, Old Print Works, it's not a level playing field, right? The private investor doesn't care about the heritage of that building or its cultural significance or the people that might use it or need to use it. They only care about how much it's worth in monetary terms. And that means that the people that use these buildings, I mean, actually now in the UK, many of these buildings that are up for sale on the open market are buildings that we own through our taxes. They're council buildings that are being sold off in a funding crisis. So libraries, community centres, daycare centres, they belong to us, and they are being sold off to private investors. And the people that are losing out are, again, the people that don't have other places to go to. They are differently abled people, they are young people, they are older women, older men, they are, young parents, they are migrants. So I think, again, we see how this modern process of enclosure creates this kind of othering, which is which I think creates fear around these groups of people. I think that's the right praise on that sense, that they don't have any place in the fabric of our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it changed, like, it seems like a truism, but it changes the landscape of cities and of places so much. And like, I was reflecting on it quite a lot, like this past week, and like people will most likely know, like the big kind of fire in Union Street in Glasgow last Sunday, which like a lot of, that's like a hugely important building in and like what is going to be done to safeguard that beyond that, like the potential for that being just open season. The kind of early investigation was looking into like where the fire had started. It's like, who even owns who even owns the shop? It's so bizarre to live in a city and to look at like, well, whose interests are even here? And you have to dig and dig and dig through the like dark web of private investment. And yeah, anyone from Glasgow in the room has visited, there's like such a more black humor urban myth that like, okay, fire's gone up, like time for a new student accommodation, I guess. Like it's just like anything that's burnt down over the past 10 years or so, it's like, well, you know, you look at like what gets proposed and said, and it's like purpose-built student accommodation or something like, yeah, it's just like, and who needs it? And like, you know, moratoriums get passed, but nothing happens. And yeah, as you say, this like outpricing, and it's just so, the way that it's talked about as though it's inevitable, like this kind of like, well, obviously it would, you know, yeah, of course, sorry everyone, we've just got to put this thing in here and we can't do anything about it, but it's really kind of challenging. I'm conscious that I'm sure there's lots of like people in the room who could speak like directly to a lot of the ideas and different things in here, so I suppose just just one kind of final question, as we kind of chatted a little bit yesterday about it, but you kind of mentioned the story of following these places for a long time with a very kind of like sharp journalistic eye, and is there any way that you've in the kind of early few weeks of kind of the book being out and speaking to different groups and speaking in different places, do you think that will shape how you see the work and its legacy and the kind of where it fits in amongst the kind of projects and things like that?
I mean, it's kind of terrifying actually publishing a book like this. It takes so long, and I was in the shed for most of it, and now I'm like, oh God, what did I say? But yeah, it's been the most fun actually, just finally talking to people about it, because I mean, I was in Southampton on Tuesday. I've got 2 babies, as you know, so I'm not like on a big tour or anything, but I was in Southampton on Tuesday, and 6 people came, and somebody wandered in and was like, what's this going on in here? What are we doing? And 2 people brought their dogs, and they were just the best people in the room. They all had like incredible stories. This building itself had been bought by the community. It was an old bank, and it was this radical cooperatively owned bookshop with this fascinating history. And every single one of them had like just amazing ideas and experience. You know, one was running co-ops, another was an architecture student who was going into carpentry. I mean, we haven't even talked, but there's so much in the book about like skills and manufacturing and like learning how to do things that we are forgetting how to do, like the displacement of trades from our cities. I think, you know, it goes to a little bit what you're saying about fires and then student accommodation. Like, who are we losing from the fabric of our cities? And it's tradespeople, it's people with real skills that we actually really need, you know? We need mechanics, we need carpenters, we need people who can help us rebuild our homes, who kept their doors open when the pandemic happened, you know, the bakers, the carpenters, I'm thinking especially of a mechanic, a car mechanic in London called Len Maloney, who was just kicked out of his railway arch 2 years ago, who never missed a single day fixing cars in the pandemic, you know, for nurses and teachers and whoever still had to work. So I think the nicest thing about this whole thing is just that, it does make me feel like really, I mean, hopeful. It's so precarious, isn't it? Any kind of hope in a moment like this, but it's happening everywhere, you know. And in a way, we just need to like talk to one another about it. And when the time comes, you know, if we're in these organisations and we are in our mutual aid networks, we will know what to do. You know, we have each other. Yeah.
What a lovely note to kind of open it up to the audience. We have 15-20 minutes for kind of audience questions. We're live streaming and they can only hear us on our nice little lapel, so if you ask a question, I'll quickly repeat it just for the purpose of anyone online, and also because I've got a mic. So yeah, we also have about half an hour after the drinks reception for like really nice
Please
chat.
stay for a drink.
Please stay for a drink. We're staying for a drink.
Yeah.
So yeah, if we could prioritize any like questions as well as anything else, and then yeah, lots and lots of chance to chat through there. We'll be about to yap about anything basically. So yeah, but I'll stop talking now so you can actually ask a question.
There's a few online, so while you guys are warming up, I can start there.
Yeah.
One is from Kojo, who says, often racialized communities are too policed to be able to set these things up, especially outside of cities. How did you find these communities worked around the criminalization of marginalized groups?
That is such a great question.
Still want?
Because that will be in the
Yeah, got it. They have it in the chat, so I don't need to repeat it.
Okay, lovely.
Yeah.
Good thinking. I'd forgot
That was
already.
Mary's thinking. I'm like, do I need to repeat it? Like,
Yeah.
they're like, no, duh. Go for it.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would suggest. So the group that's working in Birmingham, I guess it's an inner city, but they are all there. Many of them are from global majority backgrounds, and that is deeply embedded in what they're doing. And they also, as part of their neighbourhood public square, next door is going to be I don't know what they're calling it now. At one point it was a public living room, but it's an organisation called Hood Futures. And that is all based around the idea, especially when you're talking about land, the idea that the people who've been displaced, who have not had land in this country for many years, are often people from global majority backgrounds. So yes, there is definitely a theme of that in the book. And then in London as well, Len, the car mechanic, he's very dear to my heart. He is a black man and has worked for not centuries, but for decades in his community, and has had generations of the same families and hundreds of young men come through, often young black men come through his doors looking for apprenticeships and mentoring and skills. So he was a real rock in his community, and a lot of the community organising things that they're doing there, even community land trusts themselves actually, they come from the civil rights movement in the US and the need for these people to own land, because otherwise they are displaced. So yeah, I think there is a fascinating history that runs through that. I would also mention the Latin Village, which is another successful, one of the very few successful community campaigns in London. As the name suggests, it's a group of Latin traders in Tottenham who were displaced from their Latin market because a developer wanted to turn it into, I don't know, I think it was flats. And they have mounted a hugely successful campaign. They literally got backing from the UN to say that their space was of historical and cultural significance, and now they are reopening in a temporary space next door, and the Latin Village, this amazing market, continues. So yeah, there is definitely a racial justice thread. Yeah.
Another one online, you guys being shy.
Any from the room? Yeah.
Hazel, I'm really interested to know why do you think things have got worse since COVID? It's something we feel, but I'm not sure I can put my finger on why that is.
So, sorry, just to repeat it for online. So the question was, why do you think things have got worse since COVID? It's something that there's a feel of, but would want to know. People can't quite put their finger on it. So what would your like kind of analysis be?
Well, in the book I write about how politics has been totally captured by kind of tech barons, if you like. We've kind of returned to like feudal capitalism. Trump's second term, war everywhere. Like, it just feels like the world is burning, doesn't it? I mean, yeah, I talk about how that we feel, I think, more isolated than ever. And I think that's the kind of other side to that. These organisations, they're very human. They're about your neighbours, and everything that we do on our phones is not about, it's intangible and it's isolating, and it's this kind of cult of individualism, this idea that everything has to be personalised now, and I think it makes us feel very lonely, and that is accelerating, right, with AI and things like that. So the book is about how we can find an escape hatch, and I think it is through doing something with our hands in our neighbourhoods with people that we see around us all the time. You know, it's about in some way logging off and looking and doing.
Yeah, person at the back.
I think that's really important what you say. I wanted to pick up on something someone said earlier, which is that we're post-COVID, and I think it's really important that we don't use that language because so many people are unable to be in spaces like this even with masks. You know, the challenges of shared air and from an equity point of view. So I wondered if you could share, you know, you said doing things with your hand, but obviously not everyone can physically be in a shared space. Have you got any examples of organisations who are continuing to be inclusive whilst obviously not physically being able to necessarily share the physical space?
Yeah, so just to repeat the question, just kind of problematising the idea of being post-COVID and thinking about the importance of being in space and being physically present, but also what alternatives are there where it's difficult to share space, and what creates that kind of value and community without that kind of presence necessarily.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm thinking here about some of the work that's going on in Birmingham about retrofitting. They have this thing called Retrofit Reimagined, which is about how we can prepare housing that is not suited to extreme weather events, and also basically just to improve it because it's already terrible. We can't even cope with current weather events. So some of the work there is in streets where people are from different cultural backgrounds and don't feel comfortable mixing in spaces together, or maybe, as you say, they're not able to for medical reasons. But there are still ways to connect. So one of the things that many of these groups are doing, or these particular Retrofit Reimagined groups, they have this neighbourhood retrofit kit, which is kind of prefab things that you can. They're basically like kits, and you can build things that you can put in your front garden or in the street, which are of benefit to anyone. So there might be a bench, or it might be a plant, or there might be one of those little community book things. So this might be something that you assemble on your own, or you don't have to necessarily do it in the company of other people. But I think it is a way of creating a shared, some of them are like compost heaps, It is a way of creating a sense of kind of neighbourliness and togetherness, even if you're not mixing, in person.
Yeah, and I think, sorry not to jump in as well, I think like, as you were mentioning earlier about just as long as it shows that there was like a communal labour involved. So I think to like shit on AI for a minute, like it's like that always like it's the frictionlessness of that really like annoys me, like more than annoys me, but it's like things take work, and like AI usually just invisibilizes that or just like compresses that or ruins that or different things. And I think like if you can't be together with people, it's at least like not to say at least because that means that there's like a value loadedness behind that term, but just to be like, this is a thing that was co-produced somewhere and brought to you, and you're still connected by the project that you're in or the thing you're creating, even if you can't share space in different contexts or different things. It's like, avoiding things that just, are like, well, this is just made by one person, this magical, ephemeral, generative AI thing, or anything else that kind of takes out the actual connection of human people that made stuff or different things. But are there any more questions in the room? We'll maybe take both at the same time, and then the one online, and then if you want to. I don't know how feasible that will be, but at least then you all can say what you want to say. So,
Let's try and keep it quick. I was just thinking about the importance of pre-existing communities for these projects to happen. Like, was that your experience that most of them emerged out of communities that were already quite solid? Because I'm just thinking that nowadays, especially with temporary work contracts and kind of precarity and things, like people are moving around more, and I think just having that community to start with is harder. So I was wondering kind of how that happened.
So I'll repeat that one quickly and then go to the back. So to say, like, did the groups and kind of communities form or kind of emerge out of pre-existing communities, and how are we thinking about that in a time where there is a lot of precarity? People are precariously housed or precariously employed, and you move around a lot more, and what impact does that have, which I think is really resonant. And then yourself at the back.
I'll try and speak up. Thank you very much. In terms of like how you see the alternatives to capitalism, do you view that as something at the moment that is more morally desirable, or do you think it is at the moment genuinely politically achievable? And if you do feel like it's politically achievable at the moment, do you feel like we should push for initially more of a more Nordic style welfare system where we emphasize higher taxes and higher welfare states, where that still has an element of a capitalist blueprint, or do you think we should skip that capitalist blueprint altogether and go directly for the alternatives to capitalism? Thank you.
Yes, so that question is, how do we start the revolution? Do we start with the kind of transition state? Sorry, I'm being glib, but really important question, I think, about the forms that take. Are alternatives to capitalism morally important? And if they are politically achievable, if we take that premise, do you see the kind of path forward as moving through kind of more socially democratic states, using the kind of Nordic model in terms of governance, or do we kind of move kind of more post-capitalist forms? I kind of butchered that, I think, as I went on, but yeah, great. And then Mary, if you want to show the final one online.
Last one online is from Eileen, who said, how do these models work at setup? Do they have the grace to work out what they will be or have imperfect structures? Or do they need to have their structures quite fully formed? Does that starting shape have an effect on what endured?
Quite a strong theme throughout these questions, quite serendipitously in some way, about building and things.
Oh my God, I can't believe you've given me all of those at the same time. Buckle up.
Just choose one, but don't tell them.
So temporary communities, really good question. I think because all of the work that is being done, that I have documented, is kind of neighbourhood based, neighbourhood level. In London especially, some of the community land trusts that I spent time with, went to every single meeting, people did drop in and out. Young people especially, they started with this idea that they were going to build affordable housing on this patch of land in Streatham, and 5 years later they had to go and get some work somewhere else, they weren't still there anymore. The work takes a long time. So I think that isn't necessarily a problem, that the people in your neighbourhood change, but the organisation is there, and some people will be new, and that brings fresh ideas, and some people move on and they find different projects where they move to. I don't know if that's a frustrating answer, but I feel like I've moved around a fair bit too. I actually moved to Hastings because I became obsessed with the Hastings Commons. But one of the things I really learned while writing the book is that I thought I had to be kind of rootless, and I thought success was about going to lots of cool places and getting fellowships and scholarships and living abroad and stuff. And actually, I don't know if it was just having kids or writing the book, but just the absolute transformative beauty of growing roots and being centred and not needing to. Aren't I fortunate that I was able to settle somewhere? But that's totally been life-changing for me, and I think I learned that was the right way to be. It was certainly a preferable way to be in the current moment than having to move all the time. Some people have no choice, and if you do have a choice, then growing roots somewhere can be beautiful. Oh my God, I'm probably going to completely butcher I am not a political scholar, and although I'm fascinated by lots of different political models, this isn't a book about that really. And as I said, the groups often don't think of themselves in political terms. It doesn't serve them to, because they are working with people of all different political persuasions where they live. You don't not help the woman at number 4 just because she votes Tory. But what I can say is that there is a political impact of this work. That is what I've learned. And that, very recently I wrote something for The Guardian about independent shops in Brighton who are under threat. And a very interesting piece of work came out that showed how town centres with more derelict shops were more likely to vote reform. I'm looking, Jim, are you here? Oh, there you are. Hello. So Jim got in touch with me after a different piece in The Guardian and has been, we've been scraping data basically and looking at different types of community-rooted organisations and trying to figure out if there are more in like left-wing places or more in right-wing places. And it turns out, as you maybe could predict, there are more in places who vote left generally, and patterns of voting. So yeah, I think we can say that places that have more of this kind of activity are better able to defend against the right, you know, and that's because I think people see an alternative to fear, you know, that they are engaged in opening up space and making room for others rather than worrying about people taking it away from them. I don't think that was the perfect answer for your question, but and then there was something about starting, Myri. Yeah.
Eileen was asking if it can start with something imperfect.
Yes.
Or if it did have to be quite structured.
Yeah.
Whether that affected how it endured.
Yeah. I would say it absolutely always starts with a cup of tea and a warm place and a bunch of people who probably have very little in common, and there is no perfect. If there was a perfect, then none of this work would ever happen. I'm thinking about the group in Wales who basically were able to work hand in hand with their authority to reopen this or to get long-term community stewardship for a forest on their doorstep, a place where they all walk their dogs, and the local authority was about to come and chop it all down. And they brokered over the course of 10 co-development meetings a new way of stewarding the land, and now they're about to open a nature reserve and maybe be able to use the timber to build affordable housing, and it's a very beautiful story. And this did not in any way start with like somebody who had a structure or knew the answers. It started with a lot of questions and just getting really uncomfortable with the unknowns.
I think we will leave it there. What a rich book, what a rich set of discussions and questions for everyone. Thank you all so much for coming, and please do stay because I want to chat more about all of the different things in the book as well. Yeah. So hang around. I'll hand back to Mary for a quick housekeeping.
Thank you.
And then, just so you know what's next, signing will be in the front room. The drinks are laid out in the fiction room. You can help yourselves, but Suzanne will also be there. Because we are drinking, lots of people will be unmasked. We will have the door open, but it's